and welcome to this episode of Mindset Mentoring for Athletes, Families, and Entrepreneurs. I'm your host, Coach Chuck, and this is a space where mindset is explored not as a motivational slogan, but as lived practice, one that shapes how people respond when plans fall apart, identities are challenged, and familiar coping strategies stop working. Each conversation is designed to move beneath surface level tactics and into the deeper patterns that influence resilience, clarity, and growth in real life. Today's episode continues that exploration by inviting reflection, honesty, and a willingness to look at what often gets avoided when life becomes uncomfortable. We're going to take a quick break and continue with that conversation when we come back. So stay tuned. Parents today are carrying a weight that most generations never even had to name. Anxiety is rising, depression is rising, and teen suicide is now one of the leading causes of death amongst young people. And here's what rarely gets said out loud. Parents, you struggle too. You're trying to lead your family in a world that's changed faster than anyone prepares you for, and you love your kids deeply, yet sometimes wonder if what worked for you is enough for them. I'm Coach Chuck Barnhart, and I spent nearly 40 years as an educator and mindset mentor, and I've watched this shift up close. I've also lived it as a father of 4 children. My son Billy and I are launching a family mentorship because transformation doesn't happen in isolation. Teens don't need fixing. Families need leadership, language, and tools that bring them back together. This mentorship is designed for parents and teens walking the journey together, guided by experience, faith, and practical mindset training. And if you're part of the senior generation, a grandparent, a mentor, coach, or trusted voice, I want to ask something of you. Please consider sharing this with the families you know. Sometimes the invitation carries more weight when it comes from someone they trust. And somewhere out there is a family that needs to hear the message. This isn't for everyone, but for the right families, it changes everything. You can learn more by going to thechampionsmindsetmentorship.com. Welcome back. And our guest today brings a perspective shaped by lived experience, deep introspection, and a willingness to sit with discomfort rather than escape it. Doug Lynam has lived several lives in one. He began in Marine Officer Candidate School, spent 20 years as a Benedictine monk, and then stepped into the world of finance as an investment advisor, author, keynote speaker, and coach. Along that journey, he has explored the intersection of money, meaning, identity, and psychological healing in a way few people ever do. Doug is the author of From Monk to Money Manager and Taming Your Money Monster, 9 Paths to Money Mastery with the Enneagram. And his work challenges the idea that financial struggles or life struggles are simply about discipline or willpower. Instead, he invites people to look at the deeper stories and wounds and beliefs that quietly shape behavior. His insights have been featured on major platforms, including a widely viewed TED Talk and on Purpose and Wealth, and his work continues to resonate with individuals seeking alignment between success, mental health, and meaning. It's a privilege to welcome Doug Lynam to the conversation. Welcome, Doug. It's an honor.
Well, thank you, Chuck. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm really kind of excited to share your story because it's such a broad kind of, spectrum of experiences. But I always like to have my guests kind of start at the beginning by just giving us a little background about your upbringing, where you
Yeah.
kind of raised, a little background that kind of helps us get a picture of who you are. And then we'll get into more the heart of your adult life and all those lived experiences.
Wow. Yeah. So it's a long story. I'll give you the highlight reel and then you can dig a little deeper as the show progresses. But
Awesome.
Yeah, I grew up outside Chicago, in a little town called Naperville, Illinois, and my parents were fairly affluent, relatively speaking. My dad was a CEO, and my mom was a CPA. And but when they divorced, when I was maybe 6 or 7, the family really fell apart. And from my childhood perspective, it felt like money got weaponized. It became a tool that my parents used to get back at each other, and often putting their kids in the middle between that in those fights. So I developed a really unhealthy sort of mindset around money, around materialism, and the whole corporate structure. Mostly just projected my daddy issues onto all of it and didn't have a very balanced perspective of it. But I really rebelled against all that and went looking for a deeper meaning, deeper purpose, a life that I thought would have more resonance and significance. And I wasn't really raised in a religious home. Wasn't a lot of guidance or really mentoring of any sort. So I first went off to the Marine Corps. I went to, as you mentioned, I went to officer candidate school with the Marines, partly just to prove I was a manly man who could do manly things, and maybe try to win my father's approval in some way. But that didn't really seem to do much, didn't help much. And I also realized that unresolved anger issues and high explosives were a bad combination. So I decided to turn down my commission in the Marines and did what any self-respecting person would do, is ran off to a monastery. It was a great way to really flabbergast my parents. And it was really an act of rebellion. I didn't have much of a faith at the time, but went looking for meaning, looking for I figured a contemplative monastic community would be a place to maybe find some answers to these deeper kind of philosophical questions that were always haunting me. And I also was going to kind of escape the world of money and materialism. I had all those sort of religious admonitions in my brain about, money being the root of all evil. And, there's a quote in Matthew, if you want to be perfect, give up everything and come follow me. And so I thought I was really going to, live a non-materialistic, a much more spiritual life. And in many ways I did. But then in an ironic twist of fate, the community I was in went bankrupt a couple of years after I arrived, because we all hated dealing with money. And, we basically just took the vow of poverty a little too seriously. And somebody had to sort of sort that mess out. And I kind of raised my hand in naive ignorance and said, "Oh, throw me in, coach. Couldn't do a worse job than my predecessor." So I figured the bar was set pretty low, but I didn't really know anything about money, or if I went out into the world being financially illiterate, because like in many homes, talking about money was more taboo than talking about sex. Like there was really no honest conversations around money, or I didn't know how to pay my taxes. I didn't know how to do budgeting, nothing. And so I then ran to a bookstore, picked up everything I could, and started teaching myself, and eventually pulled our community through. It took about 2 years to pull us through a restructuring and a bankruptcy, and then realized I had some talent at it. I was pretty good at helping people with their finances. And so over the 20 years in the monastery, that was really my form of community service. People would come looking for prayers and looking for help with deep existential dilemmas. But what I realized is that a lot of people's spiritual problems actually had a financial cause that was either directly creating their problems or was lurking in the background. And if I could help improve people's financial lives, their emotional lives improved dramatically, and their spiritual lives as well. And that, money and materialism weren't incompatible. That if you actually had a robust and healthy financial life, that actually gave you more tools to be of love and service to the world and really live your higher purpose. So fast forward, there's a big story I'm leaving out, but essentially after 20 years in the monastery, I looked for my exit strategy, and I became an investment advisor and so I became a partner at a firm in Santa Fe, and then got two-book deal through HarperCollins. I got written up in the New York Times because I was doing. It was this weird monk doing financial stuff, and they thought that was cool. So that went viral, and I got this two-book deal, TEDx talk, and that kind of puts me up to the present day, more or less.
Fantastic. There's we're going to delve into these different aspects of it, and I think a lot of people are going to be interested by that. As you said, growing up in a family that came from money, or
Hmm.
relatively affluent, but
Yeah,
never really um, having the financial literacy,
yeah,
which is a topic that I think is something that we've really missed a lot.
yeah.
And then trying to find yourself. So I'm because I've kind of come from a little bit of a military family, and my
Hmm.
mom's brother was in the Navy, and on my dad's side, a whole bunch of Navy guys. I had thought I was going to go to the Navy flight program right out of
Hmm.
college. That didn't turn out the way I thought it was going to. But I'm curious about that short time there in the Marines and going through all that,
Hmm.
and what it was that just because you said you declined the commission, right?
Hmm.
So how did you know? How did that all kind of play out going through that the training for however long that was that you went through, and then going to that other extreme, like, and you said you didn't really have a faith, but you were seeking something, and I'm really trying to get at what it was that you were trying to find and whether you even really knew at that time, at
Yeah.
that age, what it was that you were seeking. Were you kind of lost? Kind of go a little more about that for us.
Yeah, well, definitely felt very lost. My brothers and I, we all rebelled, in different ways. And I would say we all took a vow of poverty in different respects. I have a twin brother. He ran off and became a homesteader up in Vermont, and I have an older brother ran off and joined a grunge band in Seattle. So we all kind of basically turned our backs on the material world in different ways. But to that root question of like, what is the meaning of life? Why am I here? Um, what's the purpose of it all? And without sort of knowing why I'm here, what I'm supposed to be doing, it's very hard to know. Well, what career do I pick? And do I get married? Do I have a family? Well, I just felt like I was looking for. I think I grew up in a lot of chaos, and so I was looking for some order and structure to kind of give me some guidance and guide rails on my life. And so the Marines did that very well. They really helped me grow up in a lot of ways. And I finished top of my class at OCS, and I trained with them over 2 summers during college. And I loved my time in the Marines. I really did. But to be an officer, you have to have your finish your training, and you also have to have your college degree. And so I still had a year of college left to finish. So they sent me back for another year of school, and that was when a good mentor of mine, my thesis advisor in college, who was also in the Marines and served in Vietnam, and he was like, "Hey, maybe you should," he basically gave me every book on the history of the Vietnam War to read and made sure I really understood, America's military history really well. And that got me really wondering about, like, I trusted the Marines. I have complete faith in the command structure of the Marine Corps, but what I maybe didn't have was so much trust or faith in the political machine that's in charge of it, that's telling you when and where to fight. And I thought we'll never do Vietnam again. We'll never get ourselves into that kind of conflict, will we? And this was in the late '90s, so there was nothing pressing. There were no active wars or anything. There were still a lot of smaller conflicts, but nothing. It's before 9/11 and all that. But I almost certainly would have ended up in Iraq and Afghanistan, which I thought were a complete mess. So I kind of dodged a bullet there in a way. But when I was trying to decide to leave the Marines, I was really wrestling. Well, what would be a higher calling? What would give me all the things I loved about the Marines without maybe some of the downsides? So, where would I find the esprit de corps, the community, the sense of higher purpose, the discipline? So monasticism, in a way, it checked all the boxes, but what I felt served a higher purpose, and maybe give me the let me really explore intellectually and spiritually these deeper questions about, well, who am I? Why am I here? And what's it all about?
You know, I'm really interested too about some of the things you've talked about, shared in the stories that we tell ourselves, the identity we tell
Mhm.
ourselves. So you
Yeah.
you go into this vow of poverty and all, and you had mentioned one, and I think in your introductory part there about how those beliefs around money were something that, as you then got into money management
Mhm.
afterwards, you you had to deal with it, and I really related to that because my first go round in entrepreneurship after I didn't get into the Navy was
Mhm.
an abysmal failure. And I realized there was a whole lot of money related identity issues that I got from my mom and her religious upbringing and
Yeah.
background. And, you know, it it's difficult to really be an entrepreneur when you're afraid to ask people for money, right?
Right.
Like that becomes a real problem. Uh,
Yeah.
but that comes from some of those identity and labels around religion and
Yeah.
money. So you want to talk about your evolution in those regards?
Sure. Oh, that's a long lecture. I can give you a TED talk on that one. But I think what I discovered over my study of both history and economics and philosophy is like when we're look in these, we have these what I call money monsters, these money mindsets that we can have an unhealthy ways we can have an unhealthy relationship to money. It's very easy to latch on to particularly religious scriptures in a way that they're making a point that maybe is we can misinterpret very easily. And one of the things to remember about, particularly in the Bible, if we're looking at what Jesus is telling us, is you have to remember that this is a time in history where economics was pretty much zero sum, where for one person to build wealth it was on the backs of somebody else, because it was essentially a slave economy. It wasn't even feudalism at that point. And so you basically had the very ultra rich and everybody else beneath them. This is before capitalism was invented. This is before the rule of law as we know it was invented. This is before even currencies, exchanges, their their democracy. These things didn't exist. And a modern economy is very different than what Jesus was talking about, because back then to be wealthy you had to oppress other people. It was a sine qua non, or the thing it was just how the system worked. And so when Jesus is saying, it's easier for a rich person to go, for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven, I think what he's talking about is like in the economy he lived, that was certainly true. In the economy that we're in today is very different. It's much more win-win. It's much more, it's as much cooperative as it is competitive. And so there's no reason, I think, to be afraid of money in the modern economy, because no one has to suffer for me to earn, save, and ethically invest my money. In fact, what you find is that yes, there are problems with greed and avarice. Of course, those are very real, but I think we miss the problem of poverty. Of that, money isn't really the problem. Poverty is. Poverty is the thing that is going to make your life. Everything you don't want to have. Well, let me say this: the best predictor of mortality is your socioeconomic status in a modern economy. So how likely you're to die is directly correlated to your level of income, because the poorer you are, the more likely you're to have things like mental health issues, obesity, substance abuse, workplace injuries. The list just goes on and on of all the problems that compound, and the mental stress is overwhelming. Being living paycheck to paycheck, or being truly poor, it's like walking over a tightrope over a pit of alligators every single day. And what that will do to your mental health and your sense of well-being is overwhelming, because we know that your perceived financial security has a bigger impact on your mental health than even your job satisfaction or your relationship security combined. So this is a real issue. So I think poverty is the thing we want to focus on more than the problems of poverty are much more damaging, I would say, than the problems of wealth. Although there can be problems there, as I saw growing up. But it's a maybe more a non-dualistic approach is what I've come to over the years, is to stop seeing money as good or evil, but seeing it simply as a tool. It's like a hammer that you can use to build something beautiful, or you can whack yourself in the thumb. The choice is ours. But if you disempower yourself by arbitrarily throwing money out the window, saying that it's inherently bad, I think that's is setting you up for a lot of unnecessary suffering. And I think that's really what I'm trying to help people do. Is I often call myself a suffering prevention specialist.
You know, and the whole idea of poverty and as a mindset guy and part of the whole mentorship curriculum I have and all, one component that we get to towards the very end is about trying to uncover these ideas and beliefs, labels people have, not just, you know, associated with them in money, but things
Mhm.
like risk taking,
Mhm.
right? And wealth creation and what that means to them. Because, like, my parents grew up Depression era children, and
Yeah,
they had certain, you know, fears about losing money, but that didn't prevent my dad from being an investor. But
yeah,
my wife's parents, who were Depression era children, were completely opposite. And
right.
um, my Dad was fortunate enough that during the Depression, even though everybody kind of suffered, his dad had worked for A&P.
Hmm.
Um, he was an executive. Well, the food industry was pretty important to you know depression. That's kind of depression recession proof to a certain
Hmm.
extent, right?
Yeah.
So he never developed some of those real fears that other people did about investing. And even
Hmm.
today, I talk with people. I've even talked with kids who have some of these fears
Hmm.
about investing, and they don't take advantage except for whatever some company says. We're just gonna either give you a pension or you just put in this 401k, and people don't they
Yeah.
don't understand it fully or know what to do with it. Can you
Yeah.
kind of talk about how you advise people and some of those underlying issues that keep people from taking advantage of this incredible system we call the free enterprise system?
Yeah. Well, it goes back to what I call the four pillars of finance. So for me, the four pillars of finance are going to be earning, saving, investing, and then giving. So earning, saving, investing, giving. You kind of need to get all those lined up in the right order. And so for a lot of people, they don't earn enough. They have a real earning problem. So they never have the ability to really save to the point where they have some financial security or a good emergency fund underneath them. But then once you have that, then it's like, okay, now you need to move into the investing portion because as Warren Buffett said, compound interest is the most magical formula in the history of human civilization. It's more important than E equals MC squared. If you look at how wealth compounds over time through investing, that's how wealth is made and born, and that's the beauty of capitalism at its finest, right? It has its problems. Not going to brush those under the rug, but essentially, if you don't understand how compound interest work, how compound growth works, you're basically decimating your capacity to build wealth, or you're going to be trapped in poverty because you're going to be stuck in debt, and it's basically compound interest works against you with debt, and it works for you with investing. And so, without going into a whole mathematical lecture on that, it's like getting over those fears of investing. It's tricky. It goes back to what I call your money monsters, and maybe a little bit, if we have time, we can talk about the Enneagram and how that can apply. But understanding really what is your particular psychological temperament and where do you get stuck in those four pillars. So some people get stuck in investing, and that's a real problem. But a lot of people also get stuck on the earning and the saving part, so they never get to the investing. So it's kind of a tricky it's a tricky formula to figure out, well, where are you stuck and why. And the Enneagram is actually a really useful tool to diagnose that in some very helpful ways. But it's very much there's no one size fits all answer to the question. It really depends a lot on your ego structure, and how your personality is shaped determines how you're likely to relate to each of those four pillars. And then on top of that, just to make a little sidebar, is what I call, we can either have what I call an anxious attachment to money. That would be kind of like my parents had, or if you think of Ebenezer Scrooge or the show Succession or Billions, or even what even Jesus is talking about in the Bible. Like, okay, money, being too anxiously attached to it's a problem. But then the flip side of that, which is what I really saw in the monastery, which is equally damaging in many ways more so, is what I call an avoidant attitude towards money, where we unconsciously push it away. We're scared of it. There's a fear. There's an anxiety that it brings up, and so we just never get around to the investing part because we have these money monsters that are sabotaging our capacity to really grow our wealth.
I love those four pillars because it's so true. And one of them that seems to be, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, magical. There's a Bible verse about, and I don't know the exact wording of it, but something like God basically says, you tithe, test me. If you do that regularly, I'll open the floodgates for you, what have you. And I've been amazed that the number of times I have like, all right, I need to give my money to the church, even though, oh boy, this
It's
is
hard.
tough right now,
Yeah.
and still doing it
Hmm.
and how it works out. And I don't think people fully understand it that giving, and it doesn't, from a religious standpoint, there's a whole tithing thing, but giving, whether you are giving to the church or not,
Mhm.
is such an important part of that and often overlooked. Can you kind of talk about that aspect of your four pillars?
Yeah, well, I think giving is the fun part, right? Really, it's the part where you're using the real question of all of it. Like, put kind of the macro level hat on just for a moment and say, well, what's it all for? Like, what's it all about? So you see a lot of wealthy people, they make a lot of money, but then they're still miserable and unhappy. It's like, well, because they haven't really figured out what money is for. And so now, without going on a deep philosophical dive, I think the simple answer that I've come to is it's a tool for love and service. It's a tool that lets you bring your what I call your divine purpose, your unique reason for why God put you here on this planet, to bring that to fruition and maybe and heal the crack in the world that you were uniquely designed to fix. And so when you have that higher why am I doing this and why am I here? Then the other parts become a lot easier. Then there's a deeper motivation to become financially literate, to tackle the earning and the saving and the investing. So you can get to the giving part in a really generous, healthy way where, and yeah, it's important to be giving at all stages of your life. But the really fun part is when you really have some real wealth and you have one the best part about being wealthy is time. You have the time to make a difference, to get involved more with your community and do the things that you really love and live a life that makes your soul sing. So giving yourself the freedom of time and then the freedom of actually donating actual resources to make a difference because you can't, feed the hungry or clothe the naked or heal the sick without money in your pocket. It just unless you've mastered the art of multiplying the loaves and the fishes, which I haven't, then you're going to need some money to actually make a difference in the world. And that was the real lesson, the hard lesson in the monastery is that with these good people, good hearts, and good minds who just felt like, well, we're doing good work in the world, so we don't need to be mindful of this thing called money. It'll just take care of itself, and it just won't. It's not how reality works. And so what was so frustrating in my 20 years in the monastery was like, okay, we always had these great ideas of things we wanted to do and ways we wanted to be of service, of greater service to the world, but there just wasn't the budget for it. We couldn't help people the way we wanted to because our own financial house was often in disarray. And until we got that straight, then even with our own household budgets, we get those straight. It's always going to be a stressor. It's always going to be a problem. And so when you focus on that why I'm doing it, then the other parts get a lot easier, and it gets just to be a lot more fun, and life gets way more interesting.
Yeah, I can still remember my dad kind of saying that his goal in life had always been to become a philanthropist.
Hmm.
And the message I would often give there, but for me to do that, I have to have money, right?
Right.
So he was working and investing to build up money so that, yeah, when he could retire, he could do things that he liked, but also he could give money away, which he
Hmm.
did to a certain extent. He didn't develop the wealth that he had always dreamed about having, but he had enough wealth that he and my mom were able to have a very nice retirement, and he was able to give to organizations and people that he he got joy doing, including
Yeah.
his kids and his grandkids.
Right.
So um, that's
And that's true. It's like, and that's not. I think that's so somewhat overlooked. It's like, yes, you giving to your church is great, and giving to your community is great, but also taking care of your family is really key. Like taking care of your kids and making sure they have the resources, a good education and healthcare and all the things that you want to give them to make sure that their lives are as, life is always going to have suffering in it. There's no way around that. But to really be able to give to the people you love most in a way that's generous and fulfilling for you and for them, God, that's such a blessing to be able to do that for other people. And so that's a good motivator, I would say.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, there's in my years working with kids from all kinds of backgrounds, the different districts, they all had troubles in school, but I had some very wealthy kids and
Hmm.
some really poor kids. Uh, and I was always amazed at the lack of financial literacy they had. And,
Right.
I, in hindsight, I'm like, I even as a parent waited too long, I think, to really teach that to my own kids. And it
Yeah.
kind of like, why, like, why is that? Why, for something so important, aren't we doing such a good job? So I love that you're bringing awareness to all that. It's such
Yeah.
a powerful
It's like
thing.
you got to talk to your kids about sex and drugs and money. Like those are things that are going to be very important in their lives to make sure they have a healthy attitude towards all of those things. And if and saying nothing is like the worst thing you can do on all of those fronts is to not have the conversations and not be honest about them and honest about what life is going to be throwing at them and particularly financially. And if you send them out into the world, because finance it's a foreign language and we don't teach it in schools and parents don't teach it to their kids. And then they go out into the world and they end up in all kinds of trouble that is avoidable, you know. And if we can help kids avoid unnecessary suffering, I think that's a huge gift to give to them. So I think a lot of it's removing the taboos and the shame and the anxiety and the fears that we have around it, and also because it requires real vulnerability. Parents maybe don't want to be honest about their kids about where their finances may be, and even in broad terms, or getting into the weeds with them. It requires a kind of vulnerable looking at yourself first and getting your own house in order before you're able to be able to talk to people authentically about these topics.
Now, you have talked about some of your own challenges, right? When your family broke apart and
Mhm.
all that, and in your growth, how have you seen or taken the lessons that you learned from all the different things and your relationship, not just money, but even your relationship with people and how that might even interplay? Because I know some of the great challenges, and my wife and I had we didn't have arguments. The hardest discussions we had were about money and
Mhm.
the beliefs that each of us had coming from it and all. But we all grow through that. We all bring our own baggage, and you have talked about some of your, some of the things you were trying to deal with. Can you talk about how that's influenced you now in the position that you're in as a financial advisor and coach and author,
Yeah.
speaker, all those things?
Well, I think a lot of it comes just down to trauma. It comes down to a lot of us have, you know, childhood trauma, but then money trauma on top of that. And so when you put people under financial stress, it tends to create, a fight, flight, freeze, or like refinance is kind of how we tend to react to those stressors. And so when you understand that that fight, flight, freeze mentality comes in play when we're dealing with money, and that um, and to understand what your natural response is going to be to that, and like a third of Americans have financial PTSD, and which is an amazing number. And so when you think about how much emotional baggage most of us are carrying around these issues, it triggers so much negative emotions inside of us that it's hard to have healthy conversations because, we're not having healthy conversations with ourselves around it. So then how do you have it with your kids? So really, I think taming your money monster really it goes deep, deep into all of that. What is your money trauma? What is its origination? How is it manifesting in those four pillars of finance? And then, how do you overcome it? It's a deep topic, and happy to go more into that. But that's kind of it's just understanding how your nervous system is reacting to this historical trauma you may have been dealing with, and how that might be really be sabotaging your capacity to build wealth and then have these deeper conversations.
So I'm curious. I think I probably know a little bit more, but not a lot about the uh, Enneagram
Hmm.
system that you're talking about. Can you kind of explain that to the audience and how you use that in
Sure.
in helping guide people
Well,
and
Well, I would just say, okay, I'm applying it to money, but it's a great coaching tool. It's great for kids to know a little bit about it, for athletes, for anybody, entrepreneurs, because because what it tells you is what's the general structure of your ego. And you think of it like cars. Like the car you drive, it has a unique year, make, and model, and it's totally unique to you, and you can customize it in a million different ways. But we can say there's archetypes of cars, just like there's archetypes of personality. So with cars, there's sports cars, there's SUVs, there's pickup trucks, there's compact cars, there's family sedans. We can sort of put your car into some general categorization of what type of car you're driving, even though yours is unlike anybody else's on the road. And it turns out that egos are the same way, that you have what the Enneagram tells you. Now, personalities are complicated, so you have a genetic component to your personality, of course. That's your nature, but then there's a nurture component to it, how you were raised. And the Enneagram helps explain the nurture portion of your personality. And what it basically says is that we know from the neurobiology. This goes back to the work of a scientist by the name of Jaak Panksepp. He was an affective neuroscientist. And what he discovered that in all mammals, including humans, because we're mammals, right? There's three core negative emotions that all of our other negative emotions are running off of. And it's in the limbic system of the brain, back in the brain stem here. There's the three negative emotions are going to be anger, grief, or shame. The grief, shame are kind of the same thing, and then fear. So anger, sort of grief, shame, fear. And what the Enneagram tells us, let me just back this up a second, um, is which of those three negative emotions you got exposed to more of in your childhood environment, which then creates sort of your ego defense mechanisms that you developed to protect yourself from the greatest threats in that childhood environment in order for you to thrive and to survive. But then the thing about it, so there's the Enneagram is a big fancy word. Ennea means nine, and gram means drawn. So Enneagram means nine things drawn together. And what the nine things we're drawing are these nine archetypes of personality. And so we can take those nine types and put them into three buckets. Or if we take a big piece of, think of a color wheel and you break it into three chunks, you've got the anger types, you've got this grief, shame types, and the fear types. And then really how we all got exposed to one of those a little bit more than the others. And then what happens is we have three ways we can process those negative emotions. We can either internalize it, like directing it towards ourselves, just kind of like giving yourself an emotional wedgie. You can externalize it, which is kind of like having a food fight with the world, or you can do both. And that's why there's nine types. So there's these nine stress core stressors that we might experience. Sorry, I'm mixed. There's three core negative emotions, three ways to process them, and whichever one you got the most of and how you processed it determines the core chassis of that ego vehicle you're driving around in all the time. Because each type has a core fear, a deep unconscious fear that their Enneagram type is trying to protect themselves from. And when you understand what that core fear is, and then you understand it has a whole chain of reactions that come out of that, that then basically form your personality and then how you relate to pretty much everything, but also, of course, then to money. And maybe we could give you an example in a minute here, would bring it home. But let me just pause or see if any of that makes sense.
Oh, that completely makes sense to me. And anybody who's listened to some of my other episodes have heard me talk about the power of releasing negative emotions that you're holding on to. And
Hmm.
again, big three: fear, anger,
Hmm.
guilt, shame. Um, and just learning how to do that
Hmm.
can have such a profound impact across the entire spectrum of things. Um,
Yeah.
and that's working with some of the students over the years who struggled in school. We had to help them identify what those beliefs were, the labels were, and those emotions that were attached to them,
Hmm.
because really they weren't going to make the growth academically or socially or anything until that stuff really
Right.
got dealt with. And
Yeah.
um, when we did, wow, things really usually took off.
So maybe I could poke up myself and maybe explain my Enneagram type, or I could maybe we could diagnose you, see if we can figure out what your type is, if that would be fun. And maybe just give somebody to give your audience an example of what this really looks like in practice, if you're open to it.
So say that again?
Would you be open to me trying to figure out what your
Uh,
Enneagram type is?
yeah, absolutely.
All right,
100%.
let's just so we'll do a little thought experiment,
Yep.
and everyone listening can follow along. So what I want you to do is I want you to kind of just take a minute, take a moment, take a deep breath, and just kind of think, take a contemplative moment. And I want you to think back to your childhood, particularly your teens and 20s. But even now, I want you to think about when you are in your darkest emotional space, when life gets really hard for you and things are getting rough, on average, which of those three negative emotions do you tend to feel more of? Do you feel more anger, sort of grief slash shame, or fear? Which of those comes more for you?
Definitely not anger. It's either fear or the guilt shame. I think probably is more fear.
Fear. Okay. So then that puts you in the fear triad. So that gives so now we've got nine choices. We've just narrowed it down to three. Okay. So then of those three choices, there's three ways that your childhood self processed that. So what and I'll give you I'll give you three choices and see if any of them resonate. So the first choice would be you could take that fear and you can internalize it. You drive it towards yourself. And that's what we call a type five. And the numbers are irrelevant, they're just placeholders. All right. And I call the type five the compact car, meaning they have a very small gas tank for social interaction, but they also tend to be the brainiacs. They can fit into tight mental spaces where other people fear to tread. So the Type 5, we call them the investigator, or as I call them, the compact car. But the greatest fear for a Type 5 is that they're fundamentally incompetent, or their fear is being helpless or incompetent. So it's like they're trying to take all this information from the world around them. They're processing it, processing it, processing it in their head, but they have a hard time letting it out. They're always kind of trapped in their head a bit. But then they're always striving to be extremely capable and competent and self-reliant in everything they do. So they tend to be again very self-reliant, very capable, but then they have this sort of emotional reservedness to them that makes it hard for them to maybe often connect with others sometimes. So that's one choice. Um, then I'm going to jump over to type seven. So we went from five to seven for a reason. So sevens are what we call, they take that fear and they externalize it. And that creates their greatest fear of being trapped in pain or privation. So they had maybe a very chaotic childhood where maybe parenting was inconsistent. And so what I call them the SUV of egos, we often call them the enthusiast. So they're very excited about whatever's coming next, but what they're always trying to do is kind of escape the present moment. I call them the SUV because they're kind of the go anywhere, do anything ego, because but what they don't want to be is just stuck in their pain in the present moment. So they're always like, oh boy, what's next? Because they're always looking into the future. They're kind of stuck in planning, looking ahead all the time. They're very future oriented, where we went to the five, what maybe more past oriented. And so they're very outgoing, but then they often have a trouble with sort of they get over they tend to take on too much sometimes. So that's a little bit. I don't think I'm doing it justice. And then the third choice, which you might think about, we call them. That's where you have both this internalized fear that you're not capable of, and then this externalized fear at the world. And we call type sixes in the middle. We call them the skeptic. So type sixes get stuck. Their greatest fear is being without support or guidance. So they're always kind of looking for external guidance from the world. They don't really trust themselves, but they don't trust other people very easily either. So they get kind of caught in a kind of worst case scenario thinking. So they tend to always planning for like what can go wrong. And that's maybe one of their struggles. And so we call them the skeptic, or I call them the family sedan of egos, because they want every safety feature imaginable and maybe a few that they invented themselves. Let me just stop there, see if any of those even vaguely resonates, and then maybe we can dive deeper into one of them if
Yeah,
anything
it's
resonates there.
definitely the seven. Definitely
The seven.
the planning,
Yeah.
the future
Yeah.
person. Yeah,
Okay, great. Yeah. So we say sevens are, you can tell they have a strong case of FOMO or fear of missing out, right? So they're always, oh boy, right? But planning, and then, but not being here in the present moment. So that, if that resonates with you.
definitely, definitely.
Okay. So then what we, now, so each type has a core fear. And for the seven, it's that being trapped or pain and privation. But then um, each one has what we call a worst vice. Um, we could talk about the word sin is how it, in Christian theology often talks about it, but that's a misused term. Often it kind of gets weaponized, in sometimes theologically. But the word sin, what it really means, it's an archery term, and it means to miss the mark. So, like, if it's the way that you're most likely to miss the mark.
You just you froze up there. Let's see. Well, sadly, we have froze. You have frozen up. Maybe if you could exit, and I can let you back in. Here we go. There we go.
Oops, we got disconnected for a second. Sorry
Yeah,
about that.
yeah, it's all right. So yeah, you were saying.
Okay, so like I said, so the Desert Fathers and Mothers thought that there were seven deadly sins, but they actually weren't creative enough. They forgot two, and the two that they forgot were deceit and cowardice. So when we add deceit and cowardice to the original seven, we get nine sort of deadly sins, and one of which tracks for each of the nine Enneagram types. It's like where you're likely to miss the mark more than others. And so for sevens, it's gluttony, and that doesn't mean just for food. It can be, but it's more like for experiences. It's like you never feel satisfied. So it's like more opportunities, more experiences, more adventures, the next vacation, the next great restaurant, all the things, and that's where they tend to get themselves into trouble. And so now, if we talk about how that relates to money, the money monsters for the seven. Now, there's sort of two money monsters for each type. One where we're too anxious around money, where we're maybe too greedy or acquisitive, or where we're avoidant and where we're pushing money away, where we tend to unconsciously self-sabotage ourselves in our financial lives. And where we want to get to is a healthy relationship to money. So I'm not saying you have these money monsters, but these are where sevens tend to get themselves trapped. And so if you have an avoidant seven around money, I call them the gorger, meaning they're like the prodigal son. Money comes in and it goes out, right? They gorge themselves on experiences or opportunities, so they never tend to have a harder time building up a robust financial life because they're so excited about the next experience that it's going to fund, that it becomes a kind of so the prodigal son is sort of the classic example of a gorger seven. And then on the flip side, I call them the grabber. So the grabber seven is the one who wants all the money because they think it's going to keep, if I just have enough of it, I'll never face pain, I'll never face privation. And so then they become maybe too greedy and acquisitive around it. So let me just see if any of that resonates with any of your adventures in life.
I know it's definitely the one spending it, going for the next big course, adventure thing, and I even even spending it on my kids so that they could
Mm-hmm.
have
Mm-hmm.
that next big
Right.
thing, right? Didn't want them
Yep.
to miss out on anything.
Right.
So come in, goes out.
Goes out. Right. And then, of course, to get even more nuanced with it, most of us aren't just one all anxious or all avoidant. So when we layer on top of that the four pillars of finance that we talked about earlier, whether it's earning, saving, investing, or giving, like some of us might be anxious earners, we might make a lot, but then we're avoidant savers. So we don't, it's going out for those experiences, right? Or some people are anxious savers, but they're avoidant investors, which is we were talking about earlier. So people who are avoidant around that. Or you might get the earning, the saving, and the investing all squared away, but you're an avoidant giver. You never do anything meaningful with your wealth. It becomes just an egoic self-aggrandizement project. So looking at those four pillars and your money style is really helpful to diagnose where are you most likely, where have you historically gotten stuck, and then what do we need to work on to move you forward to a healthier way of being.
Well, I love that, and it all fits in so much with the things I do with families and all, aside from money, but it all it all kind of comes together, and I could really obviously see how that can be so powerful for people that you work with and all, uh,
Mhm.
beyond just the money. It's one of the things like when I work with athletes, um, you know, particularly teenagers, right? They all get this dream of playing sports in college or what have you, chasing the scholarship or all these things, and the conversation not just with them, but with their parents is, listen, the work I do can have a profound impact on performance, but it goes far deeper than that. It's going to
Right,
impact relationships, academics, it
right,
impacts everything. And I can see how,
everything.
the same thing
Right.
with
Yeah,
what you're
because
talking about.
once you know your once you know your Enneagram type, whether we're talking about money or it applies to any domain, like you said, to academics, to athletics, but it's really helpful for understanding your spouse or your partner. Like where are you the miscommunications most likely to happen? Like where are they coming from? What is your partner's deepest unconscious fear, and what is yours? And how are they sometimes kind of bumping up against each other and creating friction in your relationship? And then also within your business. So I often do workshops for firms and go in and say, okay, if we understand how your team is working together. What's the ego structure for everybody on your team? What are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? And then how do we pair people up so that you complement each other in your strengths and weaknesses? And then maybe resolve some of the internal tensions or conflicts that might be occurring there. And then, of course, lastly, it works great for client acquisition. So if you're in a sales position, being able to read Enneagram types is really, really helpful because once you know because you can, if we go back, even just in broad strokes, we talked about those three kind of buckets, the anger, the grief, shame, or the fear types. Each of those, if you kind of know roughly where somebody lands, you know what they're really looking for from your service or from your product, or even from your relationship in your marriage, or from your teachers or from your students. Because people in the anger triad, that would be types 8, 9, and 1, just if that matters. So the anger triad, what they're looking for is empowerment and control. So empowerment and control is really important for those types. And if you're in that shame or grief triad, then what they're really looking for is security and connection. And so that's really important to know how to relate to those people in a way that makes them feel that there's that secure emotional connection and security. And then if you're in the fear triad, like yourself, then what they're looking for is security and certainty of some sort. They're trying to in different ways. They're looking for that security. So when you know those things in broad strokes, you kind of know how do I talk to this person in a way that's going to meet them where they're at to soothe their deepest emotional needs.
You know, think of my children are all in their 20s now. My oldest is 28, and their friends, our house is always like a center
Mhm.
where they're all over. And um, the conversations I've had with that generation, particularly my oldest son, who now, one of his closest friends recently got married. They're expecting their first child. They're all in that stage, but all of them are like, we were never really taught the things we really need to know about managing life. And
Right. Managing.
of course, money is a significant part of that, right?
Right.
Obviously.
Right.
Um,
And managing your emotions too around all of those things. We just don't teach kids how to manage their emotions, understand what they're feeling and why they're feeling it. And then of course, when you apply it to money, then they get themselves into all kinds of financial trouble because it's often not spreadsheet issue. It's an emotional issue. And that's really what I think Taming Your Money Monster is all about. It's like, what are the emotional issues you're having around money and why? How do we overcome those so you can get to the nuts and bolts stuff? Because it's very hard to implement the practical strategies around budgeting and bookkeeping and earning and investing until you overcome those psychological mindsets that are holding you back from having that robust emotional, but also financial life.
Yeah, absolutely. I uh, had the privilege of getting to know a woman who's doing a whole lot of financial literacy work and stuff with
Mhm.
women because from her professional experience and personal experience was so many women
Mhm.
they weren't ever really given the same sort of tools that men did. There was a whole lot of in her growing up in her experiences,
Mhm.
um, emotional um, yeah, emotions are wrapped around money that were much different for women than they were for men because of the way
Mhm.
they were raised, and
Yeah.
so she's doing a whole lot on that end. Well, this we're kind of coming to the end of the time. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I know my audience will like this. Your book has been in the background there once again on Amazon, so people can find it on Amazon.
Yep. You
Regular
get
books.
Amazon booksellers everywhere. Yep. It's getting 5 stars on Amazon. So I encourage people to check it out. And if you like it, please post a review. I'd be grateful.
Fantastic. And do you have a website that people could find out to learn more about what you do and anything that you might offer for programs? Is there a
Mhm.
particular website you like them to go to?
Yeah, you go to my website, which is my name, DougLynam.com, DougLynam.com. And if anyone's looking for a good keynote speaker, or you're looking for some coaching, or you would need some help with your investments, reach out. I do all of those things, and hopefully I do them well.
Fantastic. It's been an honor, a pleasure, and we will also make sure in the description to this that the links are there. So I really appreciate you taking out the time today and sharing your wisdom. It was a lot of fun. Thank you. Of
Wow, thanks, Chuck. Appreciate it a lot. Thank you.
course. It's such an important topic, and we really kind of that whole idea, as you've all heard me say over and over so many times, is mindset matters in every aspect of your life, relationships and money and learning and sports and everything. And you know, that mentorship that I have started talking about that we are rolling out, my son and I are rolling out, this is what we're all talking about. It covers all these different areas and the things that Doug and I began to talk about in terms of identity and these different archetypes and all that. We go into those things and help you as a family, not just your children, which is incredibly valuable just for them, but the beliefs that you have as parents come through and your children absorb those, even ones that aren't necessarily supportive or beneficial for financial literacy or some of the emotional aspects around all that. So it's not about specifics, like financial things. Our mentorship is really about the global kind of mindset things that impact relationships, your mental health, your physical health, your your financial kind of mindset around some of those things. So I would strongly encourage any of you who are parents of teenagers to uh, go to the Champions Mindset Mentorship. Take a look at that. It's not for everybody. I only accept a very limited number to keep it small on purpose. So if you think that might be interested, you could obviously fill out an application, but you might also want to just book a discovery call where we can have a conversation about what you're thinking, about your goals, your plans, challenges, all that to see if this might be right for you. And as always, until the next time, I encourage you to live life to the fullest.